Status Report. Commander Nathaniel Graves stood on the war-torn bridge of the ironclad, his voice a cold blade cutting through the chaos. Smoke curled from fractured consoles, sparks dancing like dying stars in the low light. A guttural impact rocked the ship, forcing him to brace against the command chair. Outside the reinforced viewport, Earth burned. "Shields down to 19%, Lieutenant Corvin rasped, wiping blood from his brow. "Hull integrity failing. We won't survive another direct hit." Another explosion rumbled through the structure, the deck beneath them trembling like a wounded beast. The ironclad had fought harder than any Earth-made warship should have, but the Dominion's firepower was relentless. Against their Leviathan dreadnoughts, Earth's fleet was little more than an annoyance, an insect swarm gnawing at an iron giant. Graves exhaled slowly, scanning the battlefield. Dominion warships carved through the last remnants of Earth's orbital defenses, emerald plasma lances slicing through steel and flesh alike. The wreckage of fallen ships drifted like shattered bones, silent testaments to humanity's desperation. Cities below became tombs of molten glass, whole metropolises erased in a cascade of searing light. And yet, Earth did not surrender. Through the flickering static of comms chatter, Graves could still hear their voices, soldiers fighting with battered rifles, pilots making suicidal runs against impossible odds, engineers desperately rerouting power to shields that barely held together. The Dominion called them primitive, unworthy of the stars. But if there was one truth about humanity, it was this: they fought even when hope had bled dry. "Bring us about," Graves ordered. His face, cut with the lines of too many wars, remained unreadable. "Angle us between their lead warship and the planet." Corvin hesitated. "That'll put us in the direct firing line." "I know what it does," Graves interrupted. His tone softened barely. "We buy time." The ironclad's thrusters screamed as the battered warship lurched into position, shielding what remained of Earth's command stations below. Graves steadied himself, his grip white-knuckled against the edge of the console. He knew this was a losing battle. Even if they managed to down a few more Dominion ships, Earth was bleeding out. The aliens' advantage wasn't just superior firepower, it was technology centuries ahead. Weapons so refined they might as well have been wielded by gods. And yet, Graves had seen something, a sliver of a mistake, a weakness buried in their perfection. His mind snapped back to the captured Dominion warship in Hangar Bay 6, the one their scientists had been dissecting in desperation, hoping for a miracle. It was their last, bitter gamble. "Has Dr. Halden cracked their systems yet?" he asked. Corvin's fingers danced across the terminal, relaying the query through secured channels. A moment later, the reply came, jagged with interference. "Not fully," Halden's voice crackled through, "but we've made progress. Their technology isn't just advanced, it's adaptive. It doesn't reject us completely. It's learning." That word made Graves pause. "Explain." Halden's voice was breathless, the kind of excitement found only in men who stood at the precipice of discovery. "We thought their AI systems would lock us out completely, but they aren't static. They're designed to evolve, to integrate. I think—" A distant explosion cut him off before he came back, hurried. "I think we can force it to work for us." The bridge crew exchanged wary glances. "Can you make it happen now?" Graves pressed. Halden hesitated, and in that pause the ship trembled as another Dominion blast tore through its hull. Somewhere deep in the decks below, men screamed before the vacuum claimed them. Graves clenched his jaw. "Doctor," he said, voice tempered steel, "either we make this ship fly or Earth dies." Yes, give me 5 minutes." "You have 3. Graves turned sharply, locking eyes with Corvin. "Prep the escape pods for non-essential personnel. If this doesn't work, I want as many survivors planetside as possible." Corvin nodded grimly. No argument. A warning klaxon screamed as the Dominion dreadnought loomed closer, its weapon systems aligning for the final shot. Graves let out a breath, slow and measured. He thought of the men and women still fighting on the surface. The civilians huddled in underground bunkers, waiting for salvation that would never come. The history of a species that had crawled from the dirt, survived plagues, wars, self-inflicted wounds, only to face extermination from beings who deemed them unworthy. Number not today, not ever. A flicker on the laser plasma display caught his eye. "Commander," Halden's voice cut through, wild with disbelief. "It worked." Graves didn't dare blink. "Say that again." "The Dominion ship. It's responding. Not just that. It's listening. I can interface. I can override." Graves inhaled sharply. "Then do it." Halden's hands flew over the alien controls, his eyes wide as streams of data cascaded across the display. The ship was learning. Every command he inputted, every attempted override, it adapted, restructured, became something new, not just Dominion, not just human, something else, a fusion of two species. Graves's heart pounded. "Weapon status?" Halden's fingers froze mid-type. He turned, face ghost pale. "Commander?" "Spit it out, Halden." "If I can control one ship," Halden swallowed, "I can control all of them." Silence clamped the bridge. Even through the chaos, even as enemy fire rained down on them, everything went still. Graves's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened. For the first time since the battle had begun, the Dominion fleet hesitated. Their commanders, watching from cold and distant thrones, began to realize something was wrong. A single ship, captured by the very species they sought to wipe from existence, had just turned on its masters. Graves straightened. "Doctor?" Halden looked at him, breathing fast. A slow, deliberate smile cut across the commander's face. "Take them all." For the first time in history, an empire that had ruled 1,000 worlds felt the creeping edge of fear, and in that moment, humanity's war changed forever. Dr. Halden Cross had always been a man of theories. Equations, hypotheses, carefully structured probabilities, those were his battlefield. But now, he stood on the precipice of something that defied all logic. Dominion technology wasn't just obeying his commands. It was listening, responding, adapting, and if his calculations held, it was about to turn the tide of humanity's survival. Graves' voice sliced through the static. "Halden, tell me you've got full control." The scientist's hands trembled as they skimmed across the laser plasma display, decoding the alien interface with frantic efficiency. "I don't have control," he admitted, pulse pounding. "But I have cooperation." That was enough for Graves. "Then we move before they catch on." On the bridge, the Dominion fleet loomed, their warships aligning into a formation that promised annihilation. Graves could almost hear the whispers of the alien commanders, their arrogant certainty that this battle was already over. "You don't know what's coming for you." A deep breath. A decision made. "Halden, patch me through to their command network." The scientist hesitated, fingers hovering over a sequence of unfamiliar glyphs glowing on the Dominion interface. A single misstep could wipe their progress, or worse, alert the enemy that humans had breached their sacred systems. Halden exhaled and keyed in the sequence. For a moment, silence. Then, a flood of voices, alien, guttural, layered with the distorted tones of Dominion high command. Their words were unreadable, but the intent was unmistakable. Cold calculation, execution orders, a predator's certainty of its kill. Graves leaned in, his voice steady. "This is Commander Nathaniel Graves of the United Earth Defense Forces." Silence. A ripple in the Dominion comms. He continued. "You told yourselves we were primitive, that we were beneath notice, that this was never a war, but a cleansing." A pause. deliberate, measured. And yet here we are, inside your ships, speaking your language, watching your every move. A single alien voice, dripping with contempt, slithered through the channel. You misunderstand your position, human. This only ensures your suffering. Graves tilted his head, considering. We'll see about that. He cut the channel. No need for further posturing. The truth was already settling into the bones of the Dominion fleet, the first cold prickle of fear. The ironclad jolted as another plasma barrage lanced past. The enemy had lost patience. Graves turned to Halden. Tell me you have something more than just good banter. Halden's eyes gleamed, the chaotic glow of alien glyphs reflecting in his pupils. Oh, I've got more. He keyed in a final command, and for the first time, the Dominion warship, once an instrument of Earth's destruction, moved under human command. A deep, unnatural groan vibrated through the captured ship's frame as its gravitational stabilizers reoriented, as if waking from an ancient slumber. The Dominion fleet hesitated, confused. Their warships, once synchronized in flawless unity, faltered, lagging milliseconds behind, a flaw they were never designed to account for. Good, Graves muttered. Let's cause some havoc. The captured ship fired. A lance of searing violet energy sliced through the Dominion battle line, cutting through the hull of their nearest warship as if it were paper. The explosion that followed was not human-made. There were no chaotic eruptions of fire, no uncontrolled detonation. Dominion technology consumed itself in an eerie, soundless implosion, the wreckage folding in upon itself as if ashamed to exist. On the heads-up displays, the battlefield shifted. The ironclad was no longer alone. Humanity had stolen the Dominion's sword. Multiple enemy vessels altering course, Corvin called, eyes fixed on the tactical readout. They're backing off. Graves allowed himself a tight smile. Of course they are. But it wouldn't last. The Dominion wasn't just powerful. They were disciplined. Shock would only buy them moments before the true retaliation came. Graves turned to Halden. We need more. The scientist wiped sweat from his forehead. One ship was hard enough. Commandeering more isn't going to be instant. Then speed it up. I'm trying, Halden snapped, the sharpness of his voice betraying his exhaustion. These systems weren't made for us. Graves stared at him for a beat, then nodded. You're right. He turned back to the bridge crew. Corvin, get me a strike team. We're taking another ship. A shift in the air, unease. Corvin frowned. You're personally leading the assault? If I want something done right, Graves said simply, I do it myself. No further argument. The crew moved with the efficiency of soldiers who knew death waited for hesitation. Minutes later, Graves stood in the deployment bay, suited in battle-worn armor. Around him, a squad of hand-picked operatives loaded their weapons, faces grim, movements methodical. Their target, the Dominion flagship Tarek Noor, the command ship overseeing the invasion. The Dominion might not have understood fear yet, but they would soon. The deployment bay doors hissed open. A shuttle stood waiting, its sleek design a sharp contrast to Earth's usual brute force aesthetics. Graves stepped inside, the weight of the battle pressing against his spine. As the shuttle launched, he glanced back at the battlefield, where the Dominion ships still regrouped. The war wasn't over, not even close. But tonight, they had taken their first step. Tonight, humanity had learned to wield the weapons of the gods. Graves adjusted the strap of his assault harness as the strike team's shuttle punched through the Dominion flagship's outer defenses. The artificial gravity fought against the abrupt maneuvers, pressing his body against the restraints. A dull vibration coursed through the walls as enemy rounds clipped their hull, molten streaks carving into the reinforced plating. Keep steady, he ordered, voice even, betraying none of the storm clawing at his thoughts. Across from him, Lieutenant Vance Kell, a man built like he had been carved from stone, tightened his grip on his pulse rifle. Shields on that carrier are weaker than expected, almost like they weren't ready for something like this. They weren't, Graves said. The Dominion had always been arrogant. They built their fleets as juggernauts, unchallenged and unbreakable. Their strategic playbook had no room for resistance from species they deemed inferior. And yet tonight, their warships flinched, their defenses hesitated, because humanity had become something the Dominion never anticipated: unpredictable. The shuttle jolted as it made contact with the enemy hull. A split-second delay, then a deep reverberation as the docking clamps engaged, drilling through the thick plating to form a pressurized breach. "Cutting through," their demolition specialist, Hawthorne, muttered, already moving. A searing beam of energy carved a precise incision through the alloy doors, the edges glowing like molten gold before collapsing inward. Beyond the breach, the Dominion interior loomed, sterile corridors of darkened steel, lined with ridges of bioluminescent strips that pulsed in eerie synchronization. The air was sharp, carrying a foreign tang that prickled against the tongue, something sterile yet alive. Graves moved first. His steps were measured, rifle raised, eyes scanning for movement. The Dominion wouldn't let them roam freely, a whisper of shifting air. Graves ducked, just as a Dominion soldier lunged from the shadows, its blade gleaming under the ship's unnatural lighting. A swift pivot, an elbow driving into the alien's side, the satisfying crunch of armor bending beneath force. Kell fired a burst, 2 rounds sinking into the enemy's exposed flank. The Dominion soldier collapsed. "Move," Graves ordered, no time for satisfaction. They pressed forward, each step deliberate, silent. The Dominion didn't use cameras in the human sense. Surveillance was built into their very ships, an organic network of detection that relied on neural impulses and bioelectric currents. But Halden had managed to corrupt the enemy's command pathways just enough to blind them. For now. Hawthorne paused at an intersection. His helmet display flickered with data relayed from their stolen Dominion interface. "Core chamber should be 2 levels down, but there's heat signatures on every approach." "Which means they already know where we're going," Kell muttered. Graves glanced at his wrist display, an encrypted heads-up readout of Halden's progress. They had control over a single warship, but to turn the tide, they needed more. And that meant severing Dominion control at its source. "We'll cut through engineering," Graves decided. "It's not the most direct path, but they won't expect us to take it." The team moved in formation, shadows in a corridor built for something other than them. The Dominion's architecture was designed for function, not comfort. Walls that seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm, the occasional ripple of alien circuitry shifting like living veins beneath their boots. Then, movement. A Dominion patrol rounded the far corner. For a moment, silence hung between both sides, an instant of recognition before chaos ignited. The first shot came from Graves. A single, calculated burst to the lead soldier's throat, sending the alien convulsing against the corridor wall. Kell dropped 2 more with practiced efficiency, his rifle never wavering. But the Dominion adapted fast. The remaining enemies adjusted their formations instantly, firing with unnatural coordination. A blue-white projectile seared past Graves's shoulder, the heat kissing his skin even through the armored plates. Hawthorne barely avoided a pulse blast that scorched the bulkhead beside him. "We need to break their line," Kell called. Graves didn't answer. He was already moving. A burst of motion, a pivot low to the ground, his knife catching the nearest soldier beneath its armor plating. The alien gurgled, body spasming as Graves yanked the blade free, already turning for the next target. Vance slammed his rifle butt into another's faceplate, sending the Dominion warrior reeling just long enough for a finishing shot. Then, silence. The bodies twitched once, then went still. Kell exhaled. wiping sweat from his brow. "They're getting faster." "They always do," Graves replied. It was something he had studied, back when war with the Dominion had been theoretical. Their tactics weren't perfect, but their adaptability was. They learned from every battle, evolved with every encounter. Humanity's greatest weapon had always been its ability to improvise. But if the Dominion ever figured out how to do the same, Graves pushed the thought aside. "Move. We're on borrowed time." They reached the engineering sector in minutes, the heat of Dominion reactors pressing against their skin like static electricity. The chamber pulsed with an unnatural glow, a structure both mechanical and biological. Halden's voice crackled through their comms. "I see you on the feeds. You're in position." Graves approached the core interface, a towering construct of shifting energy fields and alien glyphs. "Can you override it?" Halden hesitated. "Can you?" "Yes, but I don't know what happens after," the scientist admitted. "This isn't like before. Their systems are starting to recognize what we're doing. If I push this command, then we push it," Graves said. A beat of silence. Then, Halden inputted the command. The effect was immediate. A tremor coursed through the Dominion flagship, as if it had been struck by something unseen. The lights flickered. The energy core flared, its pulse turning erratic. And then, the ship spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in thought. A presence unfurled through the command pathways, something ancient, something aware. Graves felt it like static against his skull, an intelligence far beyond what he had encountered before, and it knew him. "What have you done?" The Dominion warship convulsed, as if something deep within its circuits had awoken. Halden's voice was tight with barely restrained panic. "Graves, there's something else in here. I don't think we were supposed to access this." The ship groaned, not mechanically, but almost organically, as if it was reacting to them in real time. The Dominion hadn't just built their warships, they had grown them. And whatever they had just disturbed, it was alive. Graves felt it before he understood it. A static weight against his skull, an unnatural pulse skittering along his spine. The ship wasn't just responding to Halden's intrusion, it was reacting to them, adjusting, adapting, learning. The Dominion had never spoken about how their ships functioned, only that they were unrivaled in power. Now, Graves understood why. The vessel was alive. Halden's breath hitched through the comms. "Graves, the system isn't rejecting us. It's assessing us." The core chamber trembled. Energy pulsed through the walls like a heartbeat, the ship's interior vibrating with something far more intentional than a malfunction. The Dominion hadn't just grown their war machines. They had tethered their very intelligence into them, forging an empire not of pilots and admirals, but symbiotic warships. And this one had finally realized that foreign hands were at its controls. Graves flexed his fingers around his rifle. "Tell me you still have access." Halden's fingers worked furiously over his display, his voice tight with disbelief. "I do. But Graves, this thing knows we aren't Dominion." "I'd be worried if it didn't." A new vibration rumbled beneath their boots, something deeper than mere turbulence. Graves shot a look at Kell, who had already braced himself, weapon trained on the doors. The Dominion were coming. Their security teams weren't just responding to an incursion anymore. They were reacting to a threat. Halden's screen flashed red. "They're locking us in." The ship shuddered as the corridors leading back to the docking breach began to shift. Panels twisted, their edges folding like muscle contractions, sealing off escape routes with a disturbingly organic efficiency. "Then we go deeper," Graves said. Kell exhaled sharply. "Into the belly of the beast. Just another Tuesday." They moved fast, navigating the ship's shifting interior with an urgency bordering on desperation. The deeper they went, the more the architecture transformed. What had started as sleek corridors of bioluminescent panels now stretched into something alive, walls that pulsed, conduits that slithered in reaction to their presence. The air felt denser, charged with an energy that made their skin prickle. Halden's voice crackled in their ears. "I don't think this ship was meant to fall into enemy hands, Graves. Its systems, they're restructuring." A thought struck him. "Is it trying to self-destruct?" "No," Halden said. "It's trying to reclaim itself." That was worse. Graves's gaze flicked over the shifting walls. "How long before it shuts us out?" "I don't know." A pause. "But I found something." "Make it fast." Halden's breath was shaky but determined. "There's a secondary core deeper in. The ship's power isn't just centralized, it's distributed. If I can reach that secondary hub, I might be able to hijack its system before it fully locks us out." Kell shot him a look. "That's a lot of mites, Doc." "It's all we've got," Graves said. "Give us the coordinates." The deeper corridors twisted unpredictably, the ship reacting to their presence. The Dominion hadn't designed these warships to be infiltrated, much less controlled by outsiders. But Graves had fought wars long enough to know that even the most perfect war machine had flaws. They reached the secondary core in minutes, ducking through narrowing passageways that felt like they were breathing. The chamber itself was smaller than the main reactor, but its energy was different, less artificial, more instinctual. Halden's voice came hurried through the comms. "All right, I need you to plug in the device I sent with you." Graves unhooked the small transmitter from his belt, planting it against the nearest exposed conduit. The device pulsed once, syncing to Halden's interface. "Connection established," Halden confirmed. "I'm overriding now." The walls rippled. A new vibration coursed through the chamber, deep and aware. Something had noticed. The Dominion ship let out a deep, resounding pulse, an unearthly resonance that shuddered through the metal, communicating. Then the ship screamed. The sound wasn't noise. It was a frequency, an overwhelming flood of pure transmission, the raw, unfiltered anger of an entity that had just realized it was being dissected from the inside. Graves gritted his teeth. "Halden, I've almost got it!" The walls contorted violently. Panels twisted into jagged shapes, conduits snapped with bursts of raw energy, the ship's entire architecture rejecting their presence like a body purging a disease. Then, the ship stilled. A new pulse flickered across the control panels. Glyphs rearranged themselves. The once hostile energy around them wavered, hesitating. Halden's voice came through awed. "It's listening." Graves straightened. The ship no longer fought them. It no longer screamed. It was waiting. "What did you do?" Kell murmured, his voice laced with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it. "I didn't take control," Halden said slowly. "I asked for it." For the first time since the mission started, Graves felt something shift. Not in the ship, but in the war itself. They weren't just hijacking Dominion technology, they were communicating with it. The realization settled in his bones like a storm on the horizon. The Dominion didn't just grow their warships, they bonded with them. And now, for the first time in Dominion history, a warship had bonded with something other than its creators. Halden's breath shuddered through the comms. "Graves, I think I just made us a deal." The control panels flickered again. The ship's neural pathways pulsed in synchrony, no longer erratic, no longer resisting. Then a new symbol emerged across the heads-up display, one they had never seen before, something foreign, something human. A signal burst through their systems, a Dominion frequency, not a distress call, not a counterattack order, a command, one that every Dominion vessel in the sector received at the same time. And it came from them. Graves exhaled. "Tell me what just happened." Halden's voice was unsteady, but filled with something dangerous. something like triumph. We didn't just take their ship. He let the weight of his words settle before finishing. We just took their entire fleet. The bridge of the ironclad was silent, save for the low pulse of energy resonating through the Dominion warship's neural pathways. Graves stood rigid, his gaze fixed on the shifting patterns glowing across the heads-up displays. The Dominion fleet, once an unbreakable hammer of destruction, now lingered in eerie stillness. A network of war machines awaiting commands that no longer came from their masters. Halden's voice broke the silence. "It's responding to us." Kell exhaled, shifting his rifle against his shoulder. "That should scare me more than it does." Graves didn't move, didn't blink. His mind worked through the implications at a brutal pace. They hadn't just hijacked a single Dominion ship. The command pathways had linked them into the entire fleet's neural lattice. If Halden was right, "We just took the Dominion's sword out of their hands," Graves murmured. And now it was aimed at their throat. Halden ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling as they ghosted over the controls. "The ships aren't rejecting us, but they're not fully integrated either. It's like they're waiting for orders." Graves glanced at the readouts. The symbols flickering across the screens pulsed in an unfamiliar rhythm, something between language and instinct. The Dominion hadn't just designed their fleet to be weapons, they had bred them into obedient servants. The moment their command structure collapsed, the ships had defaulted to something primal. "They don't know who they belong to anymore," Graves said. His voice carried the weight of realization. "We broke the chain of command, and now they're looking for a new master." Kell let out a low breath. "So we give them one." Halden hesitated. "Graves, if I issue a fleet-wide command, it's not just going to be us controlling them. We'll become part of their network. I don't know what that will do to us." A flicker of unease passed through the bridge crew. Dominion technology had been their greatest enemy, a force that had burned entire civilizations to dust. And now, it stood within their grasp. An empire's arsenal waiting for a single voice to shape its destiny. Graves weighed the risk. The Dominion had ruled through technological supremacy. For the first time in history, that supremacy was in human hands. He turned to Halden. "Do it." The scientist's fingers hovered over the controls. One breath, then another. Then he pressed the command key. The warship shuddered. A surge of raw power flooded through its systems, a response so visceral it sent a ripple through the entire fleet. The neural pathways realigned, conduits pulsed with newfound purpose, the Dominion vessels shifting in synchrony as if waking from a long dormant slumber. And then the Dominion's fleet moved, not in retreat, not in chaos. They realigned into a human battle formation. Kell inhaled sharply. "They're listening." Halden's voice trembled with something dangerously close to awe. "They're obeying." Graves's jaw tensed. This wasn't just a technological victory. This was a shift in power that would reshape the war itself. Then, the alarms sounded. Corvin's voice snapped across the bridge. "Multiple Dominion capital ships inbound. Hostile signatures confirmed." Graves turned sharply to the main display. The real Dominion fleet was coming. Not the ships they had captured. Not the forces left drifting in uncertainty. But the ones that still had loyalty. "They realized what we've done," Graves muttered. "And they're coming to take it back." Halden's fingers raced over the console. "I'm detecting power surges across their fleet. They're activating command overrides, trying to forcefully reset their neural network." Graves clenched his fists. The Dominion wasn't going to waste time regaining control. If they succeeded, their entire fleet would revert to their rule, and humanity would lose its single greatest advantage. He turned to Halden. "Can we block it?" Halden hesitated. But we can interrupt it." Graves's mind worked through the strategy in seconds. They didn't need to hold the fleet indefinitely. They just needed long enough to land a killing blow. His gaze settled on the largest Dominion warship inbound, a command dreadnought, towering over the others like a king among soldiers. "That's their anchor," Graves murmured. "We take that ship, and the rest will fall apart." Kell gave a sharp nod. "Then we board it." The tension on the bridge thickened. Boarding a Dominion dreadnought was suicide. But then, so was this entire war. Graves turned to the strike team. "Gear up! We end this tonight!" The boarding shuttle hurtled through the chaos, the captured Dominion fleet holding the enemy at bay as Graves and his team prepared for impact. The dreadnought loomed ahead, its defenses bristling with energy cannons. "Defenses are still up," Hawthorne called from the rear. "If they fire, we're dead before we breach." Graves keyed his comm. "Halden, send the override." A pause. Then, the dreadnought's exterior shields flickered, dropped from the inside. Halden's voice came through. "You have a window, take it." The shuttle slammed into the docking port. A split-second delay, then the explosive decompression sucked the doors inward. Graves moved first, rifle up, boots hitting the deck in a controlled impact. The corridors of the dreadnought stretched ahead, vast and unyielding, its architecture built for creatures that saw war as an inevitability. The Dominion knew they were here, and they were waiting. The first wave struck fast, armored warriors lunging from the shadows, their movements a blur of disciplined efficiency. Graves fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. Kell took point, dropping enemies with brutal precision, his blade carving through exposed gaps in their armor. The corridor trembled as an explosion rocked the ship, Halden's sabotage from the captured fleet taking effect. The Dominion was losing control. But they weren't done yet. A figure emerged ahead, taller than the others, clad in armor that pulsed with command authority. A Dominion war speaker, the true power behind their fleet. Graves barely had a second to react before the alien spoke. Not words, not sound, a command. The Dominion ship resisted. The walls convulsed. The corridors shifted. The ship itself was trying to purge them. Graves gritted his teeth. He wasn't about to be erased. He lunged forward, closing the distance before the war speaker could react. A single shot, point blank. The Dominion commander staggered, a wet, guttural hiss escaping before collapsing. The ship hesitated. Then, Graves pressed the Dominion override. The warship froze, its entire command lattice fractured. Then the fleet responded. The captured Dominion warships turned on their former allies. Blades of energy sliced through dreadnoughts. Ships collapsed under their own power. The battle turned from a war into a slaughter. Graves exhaled, watching as the Dominion's forces collapsed. Kell's voice was quiet. They didn't see this coming. Graves watched the Dominion's flagship shudder, its final defenses failing. "No," he said, voice even, "and that's why they lost." The Dominion fleet, the empire that had ruled for centuries, was now theirs. But something in the back of Graves's mind whispered. The war was over, but something else had begun. The Dominion fleet lay in ruin. Wreckage drifted like dead embers, shattered hulls still smoldering in the cold void. Ships that had once raised entire worlds now hung lifeless, their power extinguished. What had been an empire's armada only hours ago was now a graveyard, silent and adrift. Graves stood on the bridge of the ironclad, eyes fixed on the laser plasma displays. The Dominion's command network was gone, its core vessels obliterated, their neural lattice shattered beyond recovery. Yet something in his gut refused to ease. Kell leaned against the tactical console, rubbing a hand over his face. This wasn't just a battle. His voice was edged, weighed with something more than exhaustion. We rewrote the laws of war. Halden exhaled sharply from his station. His hands hovered over the Dominion controls, now responding to his touch as if they had never belonged to another species. "The fleet's still listening," he murmured. "They don't know who they belong to anymore." Graves didn't look at him. His gaze remained locked on the battlefield, on the Dominion wreckage that still lingered like a dying storm. Something about the way those ships had fallen, something about the way the war had ended so cleanly, left a hollow taste in his mouth. Because wars like this didn't end. They unraveled. They collapsed under the weight of their own destruction. And yet, here they were, victorious in a way that felt too absolute. Kell must have sensed his unease. This should feel bigger. It should, Graves said, but it didn't, because something wasn't right. Halden stiffened. His hands flew over the controls. I'm detecting something. Graves turned, tension curling in his spine. What kind of something? Halden didn't answer at first. His eyes flicked rapidly between data streams, tracking signals that shouldn't exist. Then, finally, he looked up. "Commander," he said, voice low. "The Dominion never sent reinforcements." A silence settled over the bridge. Graves frowned. "What?" Halden's fingers drummed against the console, his mind already sprinting ahead. If we were fighting their full strength, this would make sense. But their entire empire didn't respond to this battle. They didn't even try to counter-strike. They just let it happen. That cold weight in Graves's gut twisted into something worse. Kell pushed off the console. That doesn't track. They would have thrown everything at us. That's what empires do when they're losing. Halden shook his head. Number not if they already knew they couldn't win. The word settled into the air like an unspoken warning. Graves straightened, his voice edged with quiet steel. Are you saying they let us take their fleet? I'm saying something isn't adding up, Halden said. His hands moved again, pulling deeper into the Dominion network. Something's missing. A new feed flickered onto the laser plasma displays. Dominion data streams flooded the screens, fragments of ship logs, distorted battlefield transmissions, partial tactical briefings. Halden's hands moved with practiced precision, filtering through the information, hunting for whatever had been left unsaid. Then he froze, his face drained of color. Graves took a step forward. What is it? Halden's voice came out hollow. They weren't fighting to win this war. Graves' pulse sharpened. Explain. Halden swallowed. His fingers trembled as he expanded the data feed. And then Graves saw it. The Dominion fleet they had just destroyed. It wasn't their primary fleet. It wasn't even half of it. It was a remnant, a fragment of an empire that had already been broken. Kell's breath hitched. That's not possible. Halden shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. This fleet wasn't meant to destroy us. It was meant to stall us. A sickening realization unfurled in Graves's chest. If this was a distraction, he said slowly, then what the hell were they running from? Halden's hands flew across the console, pulling deeper into the Dominion's records. The data was fragmented, broken apart by whatever catastrophe had already struck their empire. But one transmission remained intact. It played across the screens, distorted but unmistakable. A Dominion High Command officer, his voice ragged with something Graves had never heard in their kind before. Fear. They found us, the alien rasped. The war is lost. The fleet is lost. There is nowhere left to run. Then the feed cut to static. Graves exhaled, his heartbeat slow and heavy. This wasn't victory. This was something else's leftovers. Halden broke the silence first. We need to leave. Graves didn't respond immediately. His mind ran through the implications, through the sheer scope of what they had just uncovered. The Dominion had ruled for centuries. They had crushed worlds beneath their fleets. And yet something had hunted them to the brink of extinction, something that was still out there. Kell's fingers curled against his rifle. If they weren't fighting to win? His voice dropped, laced with unease. Then what were they fighting for? A deep tremor shook the ship. Not an attack, not a malfunction, something else. Halden's breath caught. Commander, we've got a problem. Graves turned to the display. Something had appeared on the Dominion's long-range scanners, a signal that hadn't been there before, a presence that had noticed them. And then, the transmission began. Not Dominion, not human. Something older, something that had been waiting. Graves's jaw tightened. "Put it on." The bridge lights flickered. The screens darkened. Then a voice, cold, vast, unfathomably ancient. "You are not them." Graves exhaled, steadying himself. "No," he said. "We're not." A beat of silence. Then the voice returned. "Then we will see what you are." The transmission cut, and every remaining Dominion ship still floating in the wreckage suddenly turned toward them. The bridge of the ironclad was silent, a tension settling over the crew like the charged air before a storm. The Dominion fleet, those that had once been hostiles, then prisoners, and now something else, had turned, their collective movement too synchronized to be coincidence. Graves didn't need to ask Halden what was happening. He already knew. They weren't looking at a military force anymore. They were looking at something possessed. Kell's grip on his rifle tightened. "They're not acting like before." "They're not," Graves murmured. The laser plasma displays flickered with tactical readouts, the Dominion ships aligning into a formation neither defensive nor offensive, but something unnatural. The signal that had reached them wasn't just communication. It had rewritten them. Halden's voice was a whisper. "Commander, we need to leave." "No," Graves said, his mind already working ahead. "We need to understand." Halden turned sharply, disbelief flashing across his features. "Understand? Graves, they aren't Dominion anymore. That signal, whatever sent it, it's using them. And if we don't get out now, it's going to use us." Graves didn't argue. He just looked at the data streaming across the displays, at the warships that had once been the terror of the galaxy, now standing in eerie silence, waiting for orders. His gut told him something that the others hadn't realized yet. This wasn't an attack. This was a test, and if humanity failed it, there would be no second chances. He turned to Corvin. "Tactical readout. Any signs of active weapon systems?" Corvin's fingers danced over the controls, skimming through the fleet's diagnostics. "Negative. No weapons primed, no engines at full output. They're just watching us." That confirmed it. This wasn't an ambush. It was an invitation. Kell exhaled sharply. "I really hate the look on your face right now, Graves." Graves ignored him. "Halden, do we still have limited control over the captured ships?" Halden hesitated. "Yes, but only the ones we integrated before the signal hit. The others?" He motioned at the Dominion vessels locked in unnatural stillness. "I have no idea what's inside them anymore." Graves nodded. That was enough. "All right," he said, voice steady. "Here's what we do." Graves turned toward the heads-up displays, bringing up a tactical overview. Every Dominion warship that had received the unknown signal now hovered like statues, silent sentinels awaiting some unseen verdict. The ones under Ironclad's control had yet to be corrupted. That gave them some leverage, though how long it would last was unknown. "The enemy's waiting for a reaction," Graves said. "We give them one." Kell frowned. "You want to provoke whatever this is?" "No," Graves replied. "I want to bait it." Halden exhaled sharply. "Into what? We don't even know what we're dealing with." Graves nodded toward the fleet. "We know it's capable of rewriting Dominion systems, but what we don't know is how far that reach extends. If this thing can override everything, then we're already dead. But if it has limits, if it needs a link or a direct pathway, we can break it." Kell's expression darkened as he caught up. "You're talking about isolating the infection." Graves gave a sharp nod. "We separate the ships it's controlling from whatever source is transmitting the override." He gestured at the display. "Our captured fleet still has their neural pathways intact. If we issue an artificial command at the right moment, something strong enough to interfere with its network. It might sever its hold. Halden didn't look convinced. And if it doesn't? Graves met his gaze evenly. Then we learn exactly how screwed we are before we lose everything. A heavy silence followed. Then Kell clapped his hands once, exhaling. All right, screw it. What's the play? Graves outlined the plan with military efficiency. Deploy a controlled signal disruptor from one of the Dominion ships still under their command. This would act as a temporary block between their fleet and the corrupted ones. Create an artificial false command within the Dominion network. If this entity was using their fleet as puppets, then disrupting its command hierarchy, even briefly, could force it to show its hand. Use the moment of interference to scan for the true source of the signal. Dominion fleets didn't operate autonomously. Somewhere, something was issuing these orders. If the source was vulnerable, strike it. Hard. The bridge crew absorbed the strategy in silence. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and it was the only shot they had. Halden exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his hair. I can generate the false command, but if this thing's smarter than we think, it'll recognize the trick immediately. Then we make sure it doesn't have time to think, Graves said. He turned to Kell. We need one of our captured Dominion ships to get close enough to deliver the disruptor without looking like a threat. Kell's brow furrowed. That's a hell of a risk. If the signal takes it over while it's in the middle of our formation, we're dead. Graves nodded. Then we don't send one of our ships. Silence. Then Halden's eyes widened. You want to use a Dominion ghost ship? Graves allowed himself a tight smile. We just so happen to be surrounded by abandoned vessels, don't we? Kell let out a low whistle. That's crazy. Graves looked at him. And? Kell grinned. Didn't say I had a problem with it. The team worked fast. One of the dead Dominion ships, unoccupied, systems mostly intact, was remotely activated. Halden configured its navigation to appear as though it had received delayed commands, making it look like an outlier that had fallen behind. The disruptor device was placed inside its core systems, rigged to activate at the moment of network connection. Then, they waited. Graves watched as the ghost ship drifted closer to the controlled fleet. The moment it breached their formation, the signal reacted. The Dominion ships turned. Then, the disruptor fired. A pulse rippled through the network. The controlled ships hesitated, flickering between obedience and disorder. For a split second, the signal lost cohesion. And in that moment, the true source revealed itself. Halden's voice was urgent. Commander, I have it! The transmission isn't coming from Dominion space. It's coming from outside the galactic rim. Graves felt his breath slow. They weren't dealing with a remnant of the Dominion. They were dealing with something from beyond the known stars. A warning klaxon rang out as the displays updated. New contacts, not Dominion. Something else. Kell's voice was steady but edged with something darker. They're already here. The enemy had arrived. Graves watched the laser plasma displays shift. The Dominion-controlled fleet no longer the immediate threat. Something far worse had stepped into the light. The real war had just begun. Halden's voice was raw, his hands flying across the interface. I have multiple new contacts. Composition unknown, formation alien, not Dominion. These ships are wrong. Graves's eyes locked onto the readouts. The shapes emerging weren't like anything they had encountered before. They moved without the staggered formations of militaries. They flowed, no wasted movement, no hesitation. And they were watching. Kell exhaled sharply. Tell me that's not what I think it is. No one answered. No one could. The transmission that had first spoken now returned. A voice not spoken but felt, reverberating through the Dominion's corrupted fleet and into every human ship like a low tremor in their bones. You have their tools. You think that makes you worthy. The message slithered through the comms, laced with something both ancient and indifferent. Graves tightened his jaw. "We didn't take their weapons to prove worth. We took them to survive." A pause, as if something was considering. The Dominion once believed that too. The laser plasma displays flickered, data cascading like unraveling threads. A Dominion war record surfaced, distorted and broken. An old battle log, fragmented visuals of a past encounter, and it wasn't humanity the Dominion had been running from. The footage played, an alien force overwhelming a Dominion fleet, warships torn apart without resistance, entire systems consumed rather than conquered. The Dominion had not been at war with another empire. They had been prey. The feed cut. Graves let out a slow breath. "You wiped them out." "We corrected them." Kell leaned forward. "And now you're here to do the same to us." The response was instant. "You are the infection they left behind." Graves's hands curled into fists. "You think that gives you the right?" The silence stretched, a storm waiting to break. Then the first strike came. The alien warships moved, not with brute force, not with the tactical calculations of an empire, but with an inevitability that made Graves's blood run cold. Their ships cut through the Dominion wreckage, untouched by debris, unaffected by the chaos. And then the first human warship died. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a detonation of shrapnel and fire. It was erasure. One moment the ship was there. The next, it folded inward, disappearing in a ripple that left nothing behind. Not wreckage, not escape pods, not even a trace of radiation. Kell's voice turned sharp. "Commander!" "I saw it." Graves's mind was already racing. The Dominion fought these things for centuries and still lost. What did they learn? Halden's hands were shaking. "We're outmatched. Every simulation I run, we don't win." Graves turned to him, voice iron. "Then stop running simulations and start finding me a way to make them wrong." Kell's jaw clenched. "We need to hit them now, before they get closer." Graves shook his head. We need to hit them right." The bridge crackled with tension as Graves traced the enemy's movements across the displays. They didn't fight like conquerors. They fought like something designed to erase. Every Dominion ship they had turned into puppets now shifted forward, aligning into a defensive wall. They don't just erase ships, they overwrite them. That realization turned like a knife in his brain. The Dominion didn't lose because they were weak. They lost because they fought this like a war. "This isn't an invasion," he muttered. "This is a correction." Kell narrowed his eyes. "Then how the hell do we stop it?" "We don't fight them on their terms," Graves said. His voice was low, steady. "We make them fight on ours." His fingers flew across the console. "Halden, can you still access the Dominion's deep code systems?" Halden hesitated. "Yes, but the AI framework is adapting. If I push too hard, we risk..." "Then push harder," Graves said. "We're not just fighting for Earth anymore." Halden swallowed but obeyed. His hands worked with frantic precision, tapping into the same Dominion neural framework they had hijacked before. The plan was insane. It had no precedent, and it was the only chance they had. Graves exhaled slowly, hands steady on the command console. "Halden, when I give the signal, you inject the command. Kell, get every ship out of this sector the moment it hits." Kell's gaze flicked to the displays, seeing what Graves saw. His lips parted in realization. "You're going to..." He let out a disbelieving breath. "You crazy son of a..." The alien fleet surged forward. "Halden," Graves said. "Do it." Halden executed the override. Every Dominion warship in the sector, the ones they had captured, the ones that had turned against them, the ones still bound to the enemy's corruption, suddenly flickered. And then, they all activated their self-destruct sequences simultaneously. A chain reaction of annihilation. The Dominion's technology, the very thing that had been twisted into a weapon against them, was now the fuse. And the explosion that followed was not war. It was a reset. The alien signal fractured. The fleet that had come for them hesitated. Their link, their tether to control, cut in an instant. The Dominion's last surviving technology, their greatest weakness and their strongest chain, was erased from existence. And in that moment, the enemy recoiled. They hadn't planned for this. They had expected conquest, assimilation. They had never expected defiance. The silence stretched across the battlefield. Then the voice returned. "This is not your war to win." Graves straightened. He stared at the empty space where the Dominion's fleet had once been, then at the retreating shapes of the enemy that had come for them. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "We didn't win your war." He let the words sink in, slow and deliberate. "We won ours." A final pause. Then the enemy vanished. Not in retreat, not in surrender, but in recognition. The ironclad's bridge remained deathly still. Kell exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Halden ran a shaking hand over his face, disbelief written in every line. Graves just stood there, watching the battlefield empty. Then, finally, he spoke. "Get us home." The ship turned. Earth awaited. And somewhere in the deep void beyond the known stars, something else was watching. Something that had learned the same lesson as the Dominion had. Humanity was not prey. Humanity was not unworthy. Humanity had mastered the enemy's weapons, and the empire that had once ruled was doomed because of it.